All right, guys, so get a load of this. I recently had the opportunity to interview James Wesley Rawles. If you don't know who he is, he's the OG of prepping. He's one of the people who made prepping mainstream. Now, unfortunately, because he lives the life, he lives way out there in the sticks, and the only way we can communicate with him is via satellite comms, Starlink. So our interview started off great, but eventually we started experiencing a lot of disruptions. Because on the day we interviewed him, you had all that stuff going on with Elon, you had things heating up on the World War III front, with Ukraine attacking Russia's Black Sea Fleet in one of the biggest attacks to date. And many people think that those service disruptions experienced by Starlink on the day I interviewed James were in some way related to this. Now, we were able to salvage some of that interview, and that's what I'm going to be sharing with you today. However, we are going to be interviewing James again, and because he's such a wealth of information, I would encourage you, if you have any questions, they can be as advanced as you want with respect to preparedness. This is the guy to ask. Post them in the comment section below, and we're going to compile all those questions for the next interview we do. We're going to do a deep dive into how we can survive when the bombs drop. All right? It's very important at this point in time that you are taking preparedness incredibly seriously. NATO is building bunkers along the Romanian border. Things are heating up in the Black Sea. North Korea and Russia are starting to openly share weapons. It's time to start really taking this preparedness thing seriously, if you haven't already. Without further ado, let's get to it. Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. Well, it is a great honor today to have with me James Wesley Rawles, who's a former U.S. Army intelligence officer, probably needs no introduction in the preparedness community. He's a freelance writer, blogger, a survival retreat consultant. He's also the author of the well-known survivalist novel Patriots, a novel of survival in the coming collapse. The author of the survivalblog.com, numerous other books, including this one here. This is the Ultimate Prepper's Survival Guide, a very well illustrated, densely packed compendium of survival information. I'll post links to that in the description below. He also specializes in retreat, security, food storage, firearms, communications, and even attended the Army's NBC, which is Nuclear Biological Chemical Defense Officers course, which I hope to talk to him about today because everybody is a little on edge about the prospect of a global thermonuclear war. But before we dive into the different aspects of preparedness, like strategic relocation, things that people should consider, I'd like to ask you, James, what is your current assessment of the geopolitical situation in the world today with respect to the prospect of a broader global conflict, financial uncertainty, civil unrest, climate chaos? What are your predictions for the future, and what are you most concerned about today? And once again, welcome. Oh, did I lose him? Hello.
Yeah, I think I'm back.
Okay.
Yeah, we had a weird internet glitch there. I use Starlink.
Yeah, that's what I was just saying to myself. I'm like, I bet you he uses Starlink.
Yeah, we live in the middle of nowhere. So my apologies. Well, thanks for having me on. And I think my biggest concern right now is actually a repeat of the government overreaction to the COVID virus. They seem to be intent on reinstituting mask requirements and maybe even vaccine mandates again. It really troubles me to see that the government is not learned its lesson from before, and they're on the path to overreacting once again. That's my biggest concern right now. But beyond that, boy, we live in a world of manifold threats. We've got a war brewing in Taiwan. We've got a war in progress in Ukraine, and that could escalate into a regional war or even a world war very quickly. There's a lot of threats out there. And of course, the economy is always a concern, given the level of indebtedness of most first world nations, including the United States and Canada.
You're really taking seriously the concerns related to maintaining an incognito identity. And I know you talk a lot about just being aware of what you're posting online. Can you maybe explain a little bit about your strategy and why you try to keep a low profile in that respect, and maybe what that looks like for you?
I've got several different concerns with recent images or doing anything with streaming video. One, of course, is just the privacy and security of my family and our ranch. I really don't want people knowing where our ranch is. I don't want anyone to be able to recognize my face. The only photos that are out there are about 15 years out of date. So I don't look quite like the publicity photos that went out years and years ago. My other concern with both still images and video, and to a lesser extent, even audio, is the whole threat of cloning, where your identity can essentially be stolen. And with modern AI technology, anyone could put words into your mouth, have you say outlandish things. And to the casual viewer, it would appear that you were the one speaking those words. It's really scary, especially with video. That's the most convincing for deep fakes. And deep fake technology is really now just in its infancy, but I think within 2 or 3 years, it's going to be very troublesome indeed. There'll be multi-million-dollar lawsuits. There'll be false prosecutions. There'll be civil suits. A lot of things can come out of deep fakery that people haven't even anticipated yet. And I just certainly don't want to give the fakers any ammunition. I don't want to give them video to work with as a starting point.
You know, one of the worst case scenarios people are concerned with right now is, the prospect for a global war that goes nuclear. So as a former officer who's done a bit of training around NBC, how does somebody best position themselves? Because it seems as though the current administration is hell-bent on playing this game of nuclear chicken with Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. So how do people, above and beyond keeping a low profile, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but how do people prepare for that eventuality?
I think it's important that people, if they have the means, relocate to a lightly populated area that's well removed from anticipated nuclear targets. And that would be both major population centers or any military targets. So, for example, someone might have the idea of moving to central Montana, which is great from a population density standpoint, but horrible from a nuclear target standpoint because it's immediately downwind of the missile fields. If someone has the means and the opportunity to relocate, I would recommend that they move to a lightly populated area, buy a house with a full basement, convert that into a proper fallout shelter, fully stocked, preferably with a HEPA air filtration system, at least a modest battery bank, and like a bicycle generator, for example, to keep those batteries topped off, fully equipped with food storage, an independent water supply of some sort. Obviously, gravity-fed spring water is best, but most people don't have that. So it's really daunting just to think that you need a shelter big enough to have a water tank large enough to supply a family for 2 or 3 weeks. That's a lot of water. And then you need to plan ahead in terms of sanitation. Obviously, some of your food buckets, for example, can be reused into waste buckets. But the volume of fluids we're talking about here, water and then black water, is fairly substantial. So there's a lot of planning that goes into it. For someone who can't afford a fallout shelter, at least get some potassium iodide or potassium iodate to protect your thyroid. And that's applicable to anyone up to about age 60. I've read from most of the recent studies that have been done that if you're over age 60, thyroid blocking actually does more harm than good for someone who is in their 60s or older.
You are very well situated to potentially ride out a long-term, like the long-term effects of that sort of thing. And I know you focus a lot on community. So what do you think, and being a novelist, have you thought about how a situation like that unfolds thereafter? Because I think a lot of people, we're able to cover all of the Q&A with respect to how to deal with fallout and these types of things. But I think people are more concerned about, okay, what happens after that, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, in the aftermath, boy, it all depends on whether we're talking a terrorist nuclear strike, which will probably be fairly discreet, probably just one or two cities, versus a full-scale nuclear exchange. The aftermath of that is really difficult to anticipate, and we've got to assume that we're essentially be starting from scratch, especially if there's significant EMP effects that will wipe out most of the transformers for our national power grids. If that happens, we're going to be essentially back to 19th century technology. There would be a massive die-off regardless, just from the disruption of the grid alone. And all the automation that goes on with commerce, all the electronic commerce would come to a screeching halt as well. It'd be very difficult to revert to 19th century technology for most people. Most urbanites in particular would have a very hard time of it. People who live out in the country might do fairly well, but those who have a water supply, even well water, if people don't have a backup generator that has a 220 winding, they're not going to be pumping water from their wells. Especially if they're on a deep well, they could be really out of luck. There's a lot of planning that people need to do. People need to think through all the eventualities for their own personal locale, their own personal situation. I recognize that most people don't have the opportunity to relocate, but even for people who are living in the big city, there are some things they can do to get prepared that will at least give them a better chance than most of their neighbors. All that cool gear is fun, but the basics are the really important things. Water, beans, bullets, Band-Aids. You've got to get those covered before you go into the really high-speed, low-drag, fancy-dancy night vision equipment and all that. You really have to be able to house your family, make sure they have a safe supply of drinking water, food, and that they're not going to freeze to death.
And I know you have a extensive blog that I think goes back almost 20 years now, with all kinds of detailed information that people could, jump into and probably spend a lifetime looking at. You do have this new relatively new Ultimate Prepper's Survival Guide book, which is a great starter, I think, for anybody who is just...
Yeah, it's designed basically as a beginner or intermediate book for preppers. They went heavy on graphics for that book. The company that published it is famous for their coffee table books. But a lot of that information that's there is available free at survivalblog.com. People should dig into the archives. There's no secret members only area or anything like that. It's all freely searchable, downloadable. By all means, start printing out articles on the most important topics. Get that information offline in hard copy, because when everything comes down, you may not have access to a laptop computer or a smartphone. So it's important to have hard copy references, but you can have nearly free hard copy references if you go online. Build yourself a reference binder. That binder, we really need a stack of binders. You need a binder with all the manuals for everything in your home. All the recipes you'll ever need should be in a binder. And then all the key reference articles that you might need on, like how to build a water filter or how to build a fuel transfer pump. You can find those articles online, not just at my blog, but all over. Print out those references, build your reference binders, and keep them handy.
Yeah, that's one thing I like about this is my only criticism, and it's not really a criticism, it's coiled. But I almost thought that, you could probably do something where you had more of a binder format so people could add their own personal stuff. But I guess what you're talking about is something that might require reams of information. at some point, and building out a whole library. We encourage people to have hard copies as much as possible. It's great to have everything on a SanDisk or a micro disk, but should, for whatever reason, electronics not be available, having those hard copies there are of critical importance as well.
Yeah, well, it's obviously a large volume of information that people need to have at their fingertips. And of course, those binders should be one of the first things you throw in your vehicle if you ever have to bug out.
Yeah.
And of course, the other thing is everyone should have a waterproof USB memory stick on their key ring at all times. It has the volume that you can store on a 16 gigabyte memory stick is tremendous. We're talking dozens and dozens of books.
Absolutely. And, we've done videos in the past about how to build a preparedness digital library, and even videos and how-to stuff can be very handy. Reference materials, illustrations that can guide people on certain things like that. Obviously, security is top of mind for you. Why is this such a huge motivator beyond maybe just the privacy concerns?
Sure. Well, I guess to back up a little bit, people need to think in terms of their privacy now versus post-collapse. And if you don't maintain some level of privacy now, you may wake up some morning and find your whole barnyard is full of RVs because they figure your house is the safest place to be. You want to keep a low profile.
You have to find some balance between not creating a dependency, but also being charitable and doing that which is most sound from a security standpoint, because you don't want to be the only person who's fat around a bunch of skinny people.
Right. Locally, I live incognito, but I chose an area where most families are very well prepared, very self-sufficient. People around here generally just live off the land. I would say the vast majority of people where I live cut their own firewood, have a big vegetable garden, they hunt, they fish. They're already living quite self-sufficiently. And because we're in such a remote area, everyone is used to going to town for groceries, not once every day or two, but once every few weeks. And everyone thinks in terms about a major stock up before winter each year. And that's non-preppers.
Yeah, so you don't really have to be a prepper to lead that lifestyle. I think a lot of people don't even consider themselves preppers who live that lifestyle. They just kind of live the lifestyle. Speaking of the term prepper, I know you've coined a lot of terms throughout your preparedness career. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about that?
Well, sure. For one, I don't get wrapped around the axle about using the term prepper versus survivalist. I use them basically interchangeably. I did create a few terms. One of those was the acronym GOOD, which stands for Get Out of Dodge. I did not create the term Tiatwaki. That was actually someone else on the internet before I was ever involved. That came out of the Usenet news group miscellaneous.survivalism. There's a lot of acronyms out there. A lot of people who are in prepping are prior military service. They're already used to acronyms. So they just have a tendency to use acronyms quite liberally with SHTF and Tiatwaki, and there's a ton of them out there.
Bug-O-Bag, yeah.
We've got to be careful, though, when we're around newbies that we don't overwhelm them with acronyms. A lot of people never even heard the acronym OPSEC. So it's really important when we get together with newbies that we go light on the acronyms, and they do have utility, but they're not for everyone.
You've been in the prepping game for some time, so you've had a chance to see the evolution of the culture of preparedness. So you were around before, like in the early days of the internet, back in the 80s, I think, according to stuff that I've read. And so how do you think prepping has changed since you first started, and maybe what motivated you to get into it in the first place?
Yeah, I started out in prepping when it was still all just hard copy newsletters. and before most people were on the public internet. I had the advantage of being with a corporation that was on the internet fairly early, and I had access to Usenet. But it's developed over the years, I think, in a very positive way. And I hate to use the ultra-liberal term inclusive, but it really is. Prepping really has no boundaries internationally. It has no race or class distinctions. Prepping is universal because everyone needs to survive. And I find that in the prepping community, people get along remarkably well. And I spend as much time in email correspondence with liberal preppers as I do little old ladies in tennis shoes. You know, that the beauty of survivalism and prepping is that it's universal. It truly is. And everyone has something to offer in terms of the knowledge base that's out there. And as time goes on, people develop contacts literally all over the world. I would not have been able to write any of my books if it weren't for the fact that I had input from so many people in so many places with knowledge that went far beyond my own. I'm really, really grateful.
And do you do consulting?
Oh, yeah, I do almost every day. I'm on the phone with someone. It's usually by phone or Skype. Occasionally I'll travel somewhere to meet someone. If it's fairly close by, I'll drive to it. I've been sponsored for fairly lengthy travel on occasion. It's mainly revolves around relocation, retreat security, and setting up a retreat. All the logistics, all the infrastructure, things like wood stoves, photovoltaic power systems, communications, retreat security systems, whether they're very simple or very elaborate. Some folks like to go full-blown and have not just intrusion detection systems like a Dakota Alert, but also motion-activated webcams, the whole works. So yeah, I get involved in a lot of that in my consulting work. Yeah, it's not celebrities so much as it is high net worth individuals. I've had several hedge fund managers, people involved in banking and corporate executives, a lot of people who can essentially just write a check for a lot of this. I find it's kind of fun that when, normally I would give someone a priority list of things to approach. Someone who's a high net worth individual will basically call that entire list in just a year or two.
Yeah.
They just break out their checkbook. But it is kind of fun to assist people when you say, oh, well, you need this model chainsaw. And they say, well, how many should I buy? And you need this model ATV. Well, how many should I buy? And their main concern is how they can store all this stuff out of the elements. They usually end up building large storage buildings to house a lot of these things. But if they go and buy 2 or 3 ATVs and a couple of snowmobiles, a get out of Dodge vehicle, and a tractor and a crawler, all this stuff adds up in space very quickly in terms of the space requirements. And of course, food storage, you're not worried just about space, but you're also worried about protection from vermin and temperature control. You don't want it constantly going in and out of freezing temperatures. That's not good for storage food. It could be a challenge.
Have you noticed more and more people wanting to consult with you, and what is their primary concern today?
Well, actually, about a year ago, with the start of the Ukraine war, things definitely picked up for my consulting. A lot of people were quite concerned that things could spin out of control there, and it might turn into a regional war or even a world war with nuclear implications. So the number of folks asking for my consulting services has definitely increased in the last year.
And I'm assuming that security is a big concern for a lot of these people. So are they planning on just riding it out themselves, or are they going to have are they making provisions for like a team of people or just a family?
Yeah, most people are looking at teaming up, and it all depends on their budget and where they're located. If someone lives in the suburbs, they might need a pretty big team just for security. Someone lives way out in the country, they might only need a few friends that they can count on that will be able to co-locate there at their retreat. Because to maintain 24-hour-a-day security, 360-degree perimeter, 365 days of the year, requires some manpower. And anyone who's not planning to team up, I think, is foolish at this point. One family cannot both maintain security and feed themselves. And as I mentioned in my novel, Patriots, the worst situation to be in is where you have to choose between one or the other. And if you give up security, someone may come and take it all from you.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you're saying that a lot of people who work in finance are consulting with you. Do they talk a lot about precious metals and things of that nature?
Yeah. Most of them are and have at least hedged into precious metals. The high net worth individuals, we're talking multiple millions of dollars per year of income. They usually have a very diversified portfolio, and either they personally are financial advisors for other people, or they have their own financial advisors that are helping them. It's a surprising number of people who are in private equity or hedge funds that contact me. It's just probably based on the popularity of my blog and my novels, but I certainly seem to have attracted my share of hedge fund managers.
It definitely seems like there's people who are cut from a different cloth who are starting to get into preparedness, whether they be like professional class or
really interesting commonality amongst people, and all the way from people who have very humble means all the way up to multimillionaires. It's always people who are looking at the big picture, who are not totally tied up in their day-to-day existence, and who are stepping back and looking at long-term trends, threats, and mitigating those threats. A large number of people who get into prepping, I've noticed, are either prior military service, or they've worked in emergency medical services, or they are in the financial sector and are looking at mitigating financial risks.
Obviously, there's a greater interest in this stuff from a broad spectrum of people. So what are you most concerned with? I know you've written a lot about financial collapse. Do you think all of these things are just all the dominoes are going to fall at the same time? I know you talked about the pandemic and the lockdowns. I mean, obviously we're at risk of another whole other pandemic that's not even COVID related. It seems like we're reaching a climax of preparedness here, and or maybe it's just all groupthink and we're all just out to lunch. Like, what do you think in terms of your prognosis?
Here in the United States, not quite as bad as in Canada, but we're $30+ trillion in debt at this point. It's mathematically impossible to pay that off with the current currency. Unless there's a major currency reset, there's just no way that debt can be paid off. And it's time in the future, the piper must be paid. That's probably going to mean a collapse of the purchasing power of the dollar. And when that happens, we're going to see a monumental financial collapse phase, and all the way to the point of a societal collapse.
And what do you think that looks like? I know you've written a novel about it, but maybe if you can just give us even a cursory level understanding here. And again, I got to remind people, go and check out survivalblog.com. That's where you're going to get a lot more depth than we can possibly go into in this interview. But what does a financial collapse of that magnitude look like on the ground? Like, how is it going to affect individuals?
Well, if we see a collapse in not just the stock market, but the entire economy, and a collapse in the purchasing power of the dollar, it would be absolutely devastating. It would make the Depression of the 1930s seem minor by comparison, because the Depression of the 1930s was deflationary. I'm anticipating that the next collapse will be hyperinflationary. And if that happens, everyone's savings will be wiped out overnight. Anyone who has not diversified into tangibles, precious metals, common caliber ammunition, storage food, tools, vehicles, fuel storage, tangibles like that, anyone who's not positioned themselves that way is going to be absolutely wiped out. Anyone who's on a fixed income is going to be absolutely wiped out because they'll have no way to recover. If we see that level of collapse, there'll be massive layoffs. With mass inflation, basically everything that you've saved that has a dollar figure attached to it is going to be gone. Only those things that you've saved in tangible form are going to carry forward with tangible value from one side of the collapse to the other. From a practical standpoint, they will keep your family clothed, fed, housed, in water, and not freezing to death.
It's incredible that most people don't realize the value of a lot of the commodities that they consume nowadays is so interwoven with the very complex supply chain that were it not for cheap labor, technology, refrigeration, a very sophisticated logistical system, these things would be way more expensive. I mean, imagine, we go back to a 19th century way of life, if you will. The value of anything just skyrockets because in order to make that thing, it required such a complicated, globalized state of affairs that no longer exists. So your money just, it becomes worthless against.
Money becomes worthless, but your practical tangibles become priceless. Mm-hmm. Anyone who's sitting on, say, 50,000 rounds of ammunition is going to be the equivalent of a multimillionaire in the collapse, because most families only have a couple hundred rounds sitting around. And you can look at that across the board, whether it's communications equipment, medical supplies, gardening seed, fuel in storage, even things as simple as oil for mixing two-cycle gas for chainsaws. If you have that sort of thing on hand, you're going to, in effect, become fabulously wealthy while everyone else is absolutely scrambling and wondering what happened.
Yeah, and is there you mentioned ammunition. Is there a specific type of ammunition that you prefer? Is there like a caliber that you think is the best?
Yeah, well, and I realize that you've got listeners both in Canada and the United States. For folks in Canada, think in terms of whatever's popular for hunting in your particular area and whatever caliber is issued to your local RCMP folks. Even if you don't have one of those guns yourself, try to stock up on the ammunition. And also look back about 50 or 100 years. There's a lot of guns out there that are not in the registry, that have no paper trail whatsoever, that are sitting in people's closets that are going to need ammunition. So look at calibers like .300 Savage and .303 British, which a lot of people have kind of forgotten about here in the States, but in Canada, they're still quite popular. They're quite popular up in Alaska. Here in the States, I would recommend the most common calibers here in the States are .38, .357, 9mm, .45 automatic for handguns. And then for long guns, .556 Remington, .762 NATO, .30-06, and .30-30 perhaps. And for shotguns, stick with just 12 gauge and 20 gauge and perhaps some .410. If you've got a big pile of all of those, even if you haven't guessed exactly right what people are going to be looking for, or that you might, the exact quantity that you might personally need, it all makes a tremendous stockpile for barter and charity. Again, it's the equivalent of a millionaire's bank account.
And do you at all worry about the potential security blowback of something like that? Of being
Yeah, well, again, you've got to be careful about who you're trading with. You don't, especially if you're a family on your own, you don't want to be trading ammunition locally with strangers. Mm-hmm. It's better to work through intermediaries. So you'd be trading across the fence with your neighbors, and then perhaps they might be passing along some of that ammunition into the larger community. It's wise to be circumspect about what you have, and certainly the quantity of what you have. You might want to make it clear that you might have a little extra ammo available. Don't let people know if you've got ammunition in depth, because that makes you a target.
I think you make a good case for the stockpiling of ammunition, so I think I might have to head on down to the gun store after this interview, because I don't think I have enough, to be brutally honest. What about, in terms of storage of that stuff? Because you get a lot of...
Make sure, especially for anyone living in a humid climate, they need to make sure that they keep the ammunition dry. And I'm actually a big believer in keeping it in its original packages. Some people think it all should be repackaged in plastic, but the main thing is throw a packet of desiccant, like silica gel, in each ammo can and keep that can sealed until you need it. Obviously, you're going to have to label that can with the exact contents, so you're not popping it open over and over again to see what's in that can, assuming you have a large number of cans sitting there. And if you can't find military surplus ammo cans, go around to thrift stores and find used Tupperware. Get the large Tupperware boxes for like the bread boxes and the cake boxes and things like that. As long as you have a Tupperware seal, that's just as good as an ammo can for ammunition.
Okay, yeah, and is there any, what about the surplus ammo, like the more corrosive stuff? Is that...
Yeah, I stay away from corrosive ammunition. In fact, I've got a link on my website to a chart that I copied out of a military manual that shows the cutoff dates for the use of corrosive priming for U.S. military ammunition all the way up to 50 caliber. Don't buy corrosive ammunition if you can avoid it. And if you do end up with some corrosive ammunition, make sure you label it clearly. And then if you ever use any of it, you've got to clean your rifle 3 days in a row to make sure you get every bit of that priming composition out of there.
Wow.
It's hygroscopic, so that means that priming composition, or the same goes for shooting tracer ammunition, by the way, it'll leave little bits of a chemical, a salt, in the bore of your rifle that attracts moisture, and then that almost instantly starts to form rust. So it's really important that you have to very thoroughly clean your gun 3 days in a row after shooting corrosive ammunition. The best way to avoid it, of course, is to not own any at all.
Yeah, well, it's tempting because it's so much more cost effective, but I guess in the long run, when you don't have a gunsmith or a replacement, then it's potentially going to be more costly. Do you utilize throughout the winter there? I don't know if it gets cold enough, but do you utilize like the outdoor to keep your food frozen, or are you more of a...
We actually have a cold storage room, and the only problem is it will occasionally get just under freezing, so I actually have to run a small heater in that in the wintertime. Time to time, but boy, for 10 months out of the year, it's lovely. It picks up the ambient ground temperature, and it's hovering anywhere between 35 and 55 degrees almost year round. It's a super insulated room.
And so you're running a lot of your stuff on solar?
I do. We have a solar system. We've got a generator backup as well, and we also have grid power here as well, but we don't use it that much.
Is there any power generation systems that utilize just oil? Because I know there's obviously like gasoline has a shelf life, and you can use the...
Well, you could use diesel oil, but diesel fuel is very lightly processed compared to gasoline, so its storage life is measured in like 10, 12 years rather than just a couple of years. The problem is in Canada, you have a problem with gelling of diesel fuel. And regardless of where you live, there's also the problem of you need to add an antibacterial to keep crud from growing in your diesel. I wish there was some solution beyond photovoltaic where someone could generate power simply and reliably. For most of us nowadays, it means photovoltaics. Wind power is really high maintenance and a fairly high cost per watt. When I first got into photovoltaics, the panels were running, in the early 90s, we were looking at $5 a watt. And now we're down to 70, 80 cents a watt. So it's come way, way down.
Because I know those old deuce and a halves, like they run on anything. Like you could put anything into those. It'd be interesting to see.
A lot of the diesel engines you can run used cooking oil. You can use various types of vegetable oils. In my novel Expatriates, one of the sequences was about a boat in the Philippines where people were bugging out to Australia, and they were using palm oil and all sorts of different oils and pouring it in the tank and keeping this engine running. A lot of traditional diesel engines are very insensitive to the type of fuel you put through them. But one trick is getting an engine started on those exotic oils can be difficult. So what I recommend is a 2-tank system where you would start up an engine on dyno diesel, the diesel you get from a fuel station, and then switch over while it's running to cooking oil or palm oil or olive oil or whatever you're going to run through it. And then before shutting down the engine, you switch back to dyno diesel and have that running through the system at the time of shutdown, so it'll start right back up.
You got me?
Yeah, let's plan on doing another interview.
Okay.
Sorry, so many glitches.
No worries. But before you go, can you see me on the video there?
Oh yeah, I see you just fine.
Okay, perfect. Because I want to send you something here. I don't know how much you're going to need this where you're at, but it's a rare thing. And like I said, I'm going to send some messenger pigeons, or I'm going to find a way. We're gonna get somebody.
My post office box in works just fine.
Okay. I thought I was going to have to blindfold a guy and spin him around. And all right. So these are made by a local fur trapper up here. And they're beaver mitts. So these are the warmest mitts in the world.
Those are amazing.
Yeah, and they have a sheepskin liner. They have a leather palm, and
you big fat beaver.
These will last a lifetime, and you'll be able to pass them down to your children or your.
That's very, very kind of you.
Once I don't know, how cold does it usually get where you are?
Usually doesn't get below zero.
Oh shit.
No, I'm sorry. 0
Fahrenheit.
Oh yeah, that's pretty.
10 minus 12.
That's pretty cold. So, if you're out there and you find yourself out there for a long period of time, then maybe these will come in handy. And the way the weather is getting wacky nowadays, I'm sure you're going to find a use for these. If anything, you hang them up on your wall. And if you have to head over the mountains after the crap hits the fan, then, your hands will stay warm. We lost them again. It would appear that the Illuminati don't want us to have this conversation. Just kidding. It's just a technical issue. So we're going to have to start this over again, or we're going to have James back on the channel in the future when we're not having these types of technical difficulties. And feel free to leave your questions and comments in the description section below, and we'll try to make this work. And remember, you can get a copy of the Ultimate Prepper's Survival Guide by James Wesley Rawles. It's a very well illustrated and well put together coffee table style book that's a great dip in read. And it's not only for beginners, I'd say. There's an intermediate appeal here as well. So go and check that out. All right. Thanks for watching. Canadian Prepper out.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.